What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I will continue my conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. I hope you're appreciating what you have seen thus far. The information that I have shared with you is all authentic. The material that you've looked at came from my personal scrapbook collection. I don't pull anything from the internet. Everything has meaning behind it because it comes from a long lineage of my family. My dad and I used to spend many hours putting these books together. And it took us a long time. It's not an easy thing to do. At that time, they had rubber cement. They didn't have the glue sticks that they do have today. And it would dry up quickly if you didn't hurry up and start getting them on the paper. The old construction paper was not as durable as papers are today. So you had to be very careful in what you had done and be very careful how you handle things. So I take great pride in that. So when I show you something, it's not something you glance over and you download and now you have it. Show some response back to me sometimes and let me know that you got it, you've seen it, you received it, you appreciate it. And that's all I ask. That's all I ask. Now, let's talk about Joe Louis. This will be the fourth video on Joe Louis, and I decided to show you some stats. Stats to you because Joe Louis was an impact in the urban community. What the establishment began to realize in the urban community, they were making money from movie rights, not television at that time, it was movie rights. And what was happening, they didn't have a lot of movie theaters in the urban communities that would show boxing. In fact, the urban community was one of the first communities that they began to do that, and I'll tell you why. It wasn't to entertain the members of the urban community, it was to make money. How did they do that? They realized the reports they were giving out to the promoters of the movie, well, I should say household, because what it was, they were listening to it on the radio. RKO was providing the rights for members of community to listen to it on the radio. It was a way to promote their item. So what was happening, the members of the community got wise and you would have 16 to 20 members surrounding a radio. Now, when they count up the proceeds, they would say, so many people listen to the radio. And so both members would split the purse, or one would get 60%, one would get 20%, based on how greedy the promoter was. And it turns out that the head count was completely off because they anticipated a family when you had maybe 10 families in one house listening to Joe Louis's fights on the radio. So they were making money in the community by reporting, I should say, everything that Joe Louis did, because they would print it. Some new information would come out, they would print another one. Sometimes you have 4 newspapers that they would have Joe Louis in per day. Not on the cover. Probably on page 56, you would have a small space of an article on Joe Louis. Well, the members of the community would buy the entire newspaper. Now, newspapers at that time were 20 cents. They were 10 cents. They would go up to 20 cents, 25 cents. And that wasn't easy for members of the community in the urban society to come up with 4 times a day. But they would stretch as much as they could from the pockets of the members of the community by just flashing some information of Joe Louis. Joe Louis was reported in a barbershop in your neighborhood. Joe Louis bought a carton of milk for 2 families, or so on and so forth, anything. And then they would have him advertising hair pomade grease and say Joe Louis used this grease to get his hair texture the way it was. Joe Louis never saw the grease before in his life. So you would have these types of things, and they were making money that way, but they didn't make the kind of money from radio as they thought they would. So once they found out what was happening, they opened up the RKO movie theater, for an example, in New York. Now, the RKO movie theater was on 125th Street in Harlem, New York. It was on 125th Street in Harlem, New York. And that movie theater was huge. And if you know anything about 125th Street in Harlem, you would have the Apollo Theater, where you had the RKO movie theater. Then you would have the Teresa Hotel across the street. And on the same side as the Apollo Theater is now, you would have the Harlem Opera House. Well, the RKO movie theater would eventually show the Joe Louis fights. And what they did, they would charge, I can't remember if it was $1.50. My dad has to, I would have to remember from the conversations I had with him. Let's say for sake of conversation, it was $1.50. And everyone who participated with getting themselves together to listen on the radio, because that was a lot of money, getting your hair done, getting your suit pressed, getting your shoes shined, because black people had a lot of pride. They had a lot of pride. And this was a member of their community that was representing them. And although they would get dressed up in their own household, I mean, men wore shoes in the house, like literally walked around with the shoes in the house, 9 o'clock at night. And they would all gather around and they would throw punches as though Joe Louis was throwing punches, and the women would, yes, get him. And this is the kind of fight party they would have during that time. You're talking, my God, 5 families in one house apartment to listen. You didn't have air conditioning at that time, and Joe Louis's fights usually were in the summer, June, July of every year. So they would charge that kind of money at the RKO movie theater, and the lines would go around the block, sometimes double the around, going around the block, and that's how they made their money. So Joe Louis contributed in more ways than one, and I'm going to explain some stats to you, but even those stats are way off, because the amount of family members that were around one radio, the amount of community members that would go to the RKO, those stats are not complete. So Joe Louis was a tremendous instrument in getting together the communities and getting money from the members of the community. Because Joe Louis did a lot for kids. He would go to the communities and buy ice cream for all the kids. He would sit down and eat ice creams with them. He would donate so much for the kids. And so Joe Louis is not really credited for that, but he did a tremendous amount for kids. So Joe Louis would fight Max Schmeling June 22nd, 1938 at New York's Yankee Stadium. Yankee Stadium was, if you know anything about the Bronx, New York, Yankee Stadium is on 168th Street and Jerome Avenue, and there was a lot of shops there that would sell Yankee Stadium or Yankee merchandise, I should say, T-shirts, hats, bats, so on and so forth. But Babe Ruth had to share the Giants Stadium, which is on 155th Street, the New York Polo Grounds, I should say. And they were called the New York Giants at that time. So the Yankees and the Giants would share the same stadium. Babe Ruth wanted his own stadium. So they would find Yankee Stadium and in the Bronx, and that's where they would reside. You would have 6 members who was the original Murderers Row, and Babe Ruth was one of them. So that house became very famous. So Mike Jacobs would decide to have an outdoor arena, if you will, because Joe Louis was so popular that you couldn't fit everybody in Madison Square Garden. he outgrew Madison Square Garden. So they would have fights at Yankee Stadium. So in this fight, the official attendance was 70,043 members who paid gross receipts of $1,015,012. The net gate was $80,300. Joe Louis was a phenomenon. He was a phenomenon. The radio was $50,000 that they would earn. Motion pictures was $25,000. Mike Jacobs would promote the contest. And you got to understand, a black man producing that kind of revenue at that time, when the members who would pay for Joe Louis's fights couldn't go into the restaurants to eat after they watched the fights in certain areas. But yet they produced the most amount. Always been the largest consumers. So Joe Louis found out about that, and he made differences in the ticket sales when he would do the so-called Bum of the Month Club in 1940, going to 1941, 39 to 41. He made the prices more reasonable. Money was taken out of his pocket, but he wanted to make sure that members of the urban community could afford to go watch his fights. It's another thing that's not really talked about when it comes to Joe Louis. So Joe Louis would take on Jimmy Braddock June 22nd, 1937 at Comiskey Park. He was stopped in 8 rounds. The referee was Tommy Thomas. He had 40,000 or 45,500 spectators in the audience. They paid $715,470. Joe Louis would earn $103,084. All right, let's start that again. So Joe Louis would take on Jimmy Braddock June 22nd, 1937 at Comiskey Park. He would stop him in 8 rounds. He would take a percentage of the purse. His purse was $103,684. He had 45,500 members of the audience that would contribute $17,147. Now for Jimmy Braddock, the radio and movie was $75,000. Braddock would receive 50% of the share of $293,660.30. Joe Louis would receive 17.5% of the share of $103,684. The rental of Comiskey Park was $22,000, and that would be rented out by Mike Jacobs, the promoter. Now Joe Louis would take on Billy Conn June 18th, 1941. He fought him at the Polo Grounds in New York. It was scheduled for 15 rounds. 54,487 spectators would contribute $451,743. Joe Louis's share was 40%. He earned $153,905. Billy Conn's share was 20%. He earned $70,000. Mike Jacobs was the promoter for that bout. Now they fought once again. Now that fight was June 18, 1941. They would fight again June 19, 1946 at New York's Yankee Stadium. The contest was scheduled for 15 rounds. It was 45,266 members of the audience. They contributed $1,925,564 for that bout. It was $50,000 for the radio rights. Joe Louis's share was 40% at $625,916.44. Billy Conn was 20%, and he would earn $325,958.22. Now, I want you to understand, who do you think contributed the most viewership of those fights? Joe Louis. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted Joe Louis to face Max Schmeling in 1938, because Joe Louis was a ticket draw. Joe Louis could punch. When you got knocked out by Joe Louis, you did backflips, you did 360s, you bounced off the canvas, you bounced off the ropes, only to bounce into a left hook. You never knew how the man was going to fall. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when and how. So he was very entertaining. His hands were very fast, and Joe Louis was stopped once by Max Schmeling. So he was vulnerable to the eye of spectators that were very curious. So he can sell tickets that way. He also sold tickets because he was vulnerable. He was stopped by Max Schmeling in 12 rounds in New York's Yankee Stadium in 1936. That the members of the urban community they were on pins and needles. They had to hear for themselves in real time. They don't want to wake up the next morning and find out that Joe Louis might have lost. They wanted to know before they went to bed that they can sleep comfortably knowing that Joe Louis won. The other thing, when Joe Louis won a fight, what it did for the black members of the community, it gave them a sense of pride that they could wake up the next morning, go to work, or whoever they might have been working for, or whatever shops they had on their own, and listen to members of the white community brag about their hero, Joe Louis. Because Joe Louis looked like them. And if you can talk that fond about Joe Louis, who looked like me, maybe one day I can be a part of the conversation. That was the hope. That was the representation that Joe Louis would have for the black community. But my God, when Joe Louis fought, nothing went on outside. You couldn't hear a pin drop. All you heard was the fight call. And Glenn McCarthy was the announcer that evening. And between all the radios that was blasting through the open windows of the tenement houses, you can hear the fight from outside because there was no noise outside. As soon as the fight was over, as soon as a man went down, no one celebrated. They all made gestures with their hands raising, mouth wide open, but they didn't say anything until Arthur Donovan would completely count the man out. When that happened, all hell broke loose. Rolls of toilet paper was thrown out of the window as confetti. People ran outside. I can remember when Mike Tyson was stopped by Buster Douglas. I couldn't go to that fight. That's in Japan. So I remember what it was like when everyone ran outside. That's the only time that's happened to my memory. And I lived in an apartment building at that time. And everybody ran outside. It was as though we had a war. And everybody couldn't believe what they witnessed, and they would go out and tell other people, could you believe what just happened? And they would yell from outside, yo, let me come downstairs and tell you. And they would run downstairs. It was a theatrical moment. And that's what it would have been like if you were around in Joe Louis's time, because that's how it was described to me. And when my grandfather and father explained that to me, I can remember similar instances with like Mike Tyson when he was stopped, and when you had Roberto Duran knocked out by Thomas Hearns. I was at that fight. Now I think about it, I was at a lot of those fights during the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, 2000s. When Michael Dokes was knocked out by Donovan Razor Ruddock with the smash, he was out for 7.5 minutes. That's a long time. And I remember, because you didn't have phones and you didn't have that kind of thing yet, but you didn't have social media. And you had to hear about it the next morning on the news, the actual news. But Joe Louis, man, my God, the stories that I heard of Joe Louis and the things that I've been told of Joe Louis, it's just quite remarkable. So my dad would collect a lot of memorabilia of Joe Louis, particularly paper items. I got fortunate because I inherited a lot of what he had, but I also collected things myself. I knew a lot of people who had merchandise of Joe Louis, who had items of Joe Louis, and I would get them from them, obviously. I have 50 boxing cards of Joe Louis. Cigarette cards, church cards, boxing exhibit cards. You know, many, many cards, different colors, pink, blue, green, red, yellow, of the boxing exhibit cards. So I've always been a collector of Joe Louis. Joe Louis used to come out in the Daily News in the 1930s. They would have a double-page spread of Joe Louis facing Max Baer, Joe Louis facing Jimmy Braddock, Joe Louis facing John Henry Lewis, facing Bob Pastor, facing Tommy Farr. I have all of those. And it was an honor and a thrill, as my dad remembers, to go to the newspaper stand and kind of peel open the newspaper to see if those articles were in there. And you never know what you would expect when you went to the newsstand. I can remember that in the 1990s, 1980s. So I just wanted to share that with you. Joe Louis was a thrill. He was the heavyweight of the 1930s. Began in 1934. He would end his career in 1949. But he would relinquish his title. And the other thing about Joe Louis, he appointed the second black heavyweight championship fight between two black fighters. The first one was Jack Johnson and battling Jim Johnson in 1913. The second one was Jersey Joe Walcott and Eddie Charles in 1949. Joe Louis, we have a lot to be thankful for. It was Joe Louis who fought way past his time. He would take on Lee Savoy in 1951. He would defeat Lee Savoy. Eddie Charles was not recognized as Universal Champion. He would defeat Joe Louis in 1950 in New York's Yankee Stadium. And they would now recognize Eddie Charles as a world champion, but they didn't really give him full credit. The British Boxing Board of Control didn't recognize Eddie Charles because Lee Savoy was supposed to get the shot in 1948 when Joe Louis would give Jersey Joe Walcott a return go. So the British Boxing Board of Control, as far as they were concerned, Lee Savoy didn't get his shot, so Eddie Charles wasn't recognized. It wasn't until Joe Louis would defeat Lee Savoy in 51, Eddie Charles had defeated Joe Louis in 50, so then they would begin to recognize Eddie Charles as Universal World Heavyweight Champion. So Joe Louis had a lot of impact. He would also be a coin or a pawn for the IBC. Jim Norris would, let me just say it this way. As Don King would have his son-in-law, Carl King, in charge of Mike Tyson's fan club because he handled the money. And he would have Carl King, the manager of fighters, He had to because of the Muhammad Ali Act. That's what Jim Norris had Joe Louis for, because he was mob tied to Frankie Carbo. Oh, boxing is something else. So I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. I want to thank you for listening to the complete history of boxing. We still got quite a ways to go. Obviously based on the reaction of the members in the audience. That can stop any time if you're not interested. But I do appreciate doing this, and I do appreciate your time. So thanks for listening. Into the next video. Be well. Peace.